So without further ado, we already have several questions that are being asked, and I will try to get to all of the questions on time. Okay, so this question is for Priyanka. Thank you so much for the wonderful session. My question is for Priyanka. It would be great if you could talk a little bit more about Bulbul Chaudhary's dance forms. Besides Uday Shankar, were there influences of classical forms, Rabindra Nitya, and or regional dance forms? So if you could address that briefly, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nandini, for your question. And this is something I couldn't touch in my paper because of the lack of time, but I have done it in my longer article, which I've submitted for the journal. Yes, in fact, Bulbul's first dance piece when he was performing as a 16-year-old student in East Bengal, the piece was called Chatok, or a Jacobin cuckoo bird. And this was influenced by his interactions with two students who were studying in Shantiniketan, Rabindranath Tagore's university in Bengal. And it kind of coincided with the time when Tagore had just come back from his travels in Southeast Asia and was making dance as an independent rather than auxiliary subject of study in Vishwabharati, his university. So yes, definitely influence of Rabindranath Tagore there, but also the influence of Indian People's Theatre Association, IPTA, and Bulbul was very closely associated with it. So he was following that kind of vocabulary and idiom and that political ideology. And for those who don't know what the IPTA is, it was a cultural platform of the Communist Party of India. It was functional in the 1940s up until the partition of India. So yes, these two were strong influences. Also, his literary networks in Calcutta as he was studying there as a master's student, and his association with film actresses as dancers in the Bengali film industry, especially actresses like Sadhana Bose. And if you want to know more about this, Usha Iyer's new book on corporeal histories of film dance, she talks a lot about Sadhana Bose and Azuri. And Bulbul had encounters with all these dancer actresses during his lifetime. So there were multiple influences, but yes, thank you for pointing out especially the influence of Rabindranath Tagore. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Priyanka. Next question is for Kristen. Given their concerns with authenticity and the origins of Bollywood and its influences from outside India, how much awareness is there among the dancers and the groups who perform at the festival and attendees at the festival of Bollywood's place among other kinds of dances of India? How does that relate to assumed or understood or articulated definitions of authenticity? This also relates to Ping-hsiu's concerns with tensions relating to various terminologies. Kristen?
Thank you for the question. The festival itself, the dance performances are reasonably evenly split between classical dances and Bollywood dances. So, and the visiting Indian dancers are always classical dancers. So like when I was last there in 2019, there was a group of Manipuri dancers who were performing and sort of featured, and they were the finale both nights of the festival. And so I think the people who are watching, they're seeing Kathak, they're seeing lots of Bharatnatyam, they're seeing Odissi, so they're seeing other classical dances as well. But I think the sort of energy and excitement of the festival revolves around hearing those familiar Bollywood songs. So people get really excited when those start playing and everyone, is like dancing in their seats. So there's a lot of that. But with the definitions of authenticity, yeah, it is interesting because of course Bollywood itself is sort of not sort of, is a hybrid, cobbled together form that includes, Western dance. It includes a lot of different bits and pieces, which is why it has been, traditionally such an easy dance to pick up and learn, because you don't need that classical training with the guru. You can sort of, imitate the television and pick things up. More recently, it's gotten, with the teachers in the schools, it's gotten less so. But yeah, I think that they're really saying, and the dancers themselves, most of the ones that were willing to talk to me were the ones who really were proud of their connections to India and of their groups. But all of the dancers in the groups are not quite so much, right? Like when I interviewed the Sandosham dancers or the Love Bollywood Tokyo dancers, a lot of those dancers are just joining the troupe for exercise and because it's fun. They don't watch the films. They don't have any interest in Indian culture, although the leaders of the groups do. So there's a disconnect, I think, between the people who are starting and sustaining and teaching and the people who are just kind of in the core of dancers, a lot of whom are doing it just for fun and for fitness. I hope that helps.
That's really interesting. Sort of building upon that question, another similar question that was asked to Ping-hsiu as well. So in addition to that question about the tensions between various terminologies, Tejaswini Niranjana also asks, in Hong Kong and also in mainland China, the term classical tends to be associated with Western music and dance, and the term traditional with Indian or Chinese performances. So I wonder if this habitual association of quote unquote classical with the West also muddles the identification of something as a folk. So would you like to address that a little bit, Ping-hsiu?
Yes, thank you, Teju, for the comment. And it is certainly something that has been percolating since I started writing this vignette, and also in organizing that specific event, the difficulty within which we, for finding an expert on South Asian classical music being so difficult, and in the end having to ask people from the musicology department, and then finding out that most of them cater only to European or Chinese classical music. Was very revealing of the sort of point of reference for many of the students in Chinese University of Hong Kong or Lingnan University, that the association of the classical is often and almost always with the Euro-American West. And yes, and I certainly think that this has had an impact on the sequestering of Indian classical dance as something that is ethnic or folk. And yes, and I would definitely, I will delve deeper into this in my paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Ping-hsiu. Last but not least, and in the interest of time, we have only time for the last remaining questions for Beiyu. So any other questions that were not being addressed, they will still be forwarded to each of the presenters. And so I ask for your understanding. So these questions for Beiyu are as follows. Could you give examples of what you mean by multicultural dance in Singapore, using cultural elements that are Malay, Indian, and Chinese? And also the question, in the making of the multi-ethnic dance traditions in Singapore, how the inter-Asian aesthetic circulation in dialogue with the country's self-identification has operated between East and West, or the concept of East and West? How has the trajectory of development of Singapore been in terms of dance after 1980s? Because your primary sort of presentation was also kind of focusing on those particular eras. So if you could address any part of these questions, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for these two wonderful questions. Actually, they're quite tough because for the first question, multicultural dance using these different cultural elements. Well, I have to admit that because this is a study basically based on historical materials and it's not contemporary. So many of the materials I have were visual and there were no recorded performance to approach. And also there were no oral biography or oral histories left for the practitioner to narrate how actually they infuse these elements. So it is really difficult for me to unpack the complex choreography method in a piece that was created in 1950s and 1960s. So what I have at hand was kind of a couple of materials that depicting, for example, I'm sharing briefly sharing a screen like this one. The fish folk suit, the choreography in 1981. It is one kind of multicultural dance making that belonged to the category I named joint choreography, naming that there are cross-ethnic interracial collaboration between these different race peoples, Chinese, Malay, and Indians. They come together, they learn their own ethnic dance, of course. And also one of the requirements for the company was to learn each other's unique, distinctive dance style. Like the Chinese dancer had the knowledge of that particular form of Indian dance. So when they came together to make a new choreography, they find a story like the Fisher folk suit basically depicted. It's about a scene that fishermen of different ethnicities live harmoniously in the fishing village of Singapore in 1950s. So they were using their own ethnic style dance to render the lively scene of this harmonious picture of the 1950s of the fisher folks. So that was how I understand they integrate the elements. And there are also more exciting ones of those hybrid creations about the butterfly lovers, this one, they use Chinese costumes and they combine the Indian classic dance, Bharatanatyam for faster movements, and also for slower steps, they use Chinese opera conventions and also Chinese operatic acrobatics and folk dances. So these were available because basically the director, Mr. Bhaskar, he put it in his biography. So that's why I was able to approach the performance more intimately. Whereas the rest of the performance, I could hardly find any source about how they really integrate the elements. And also for the second question, I briefly elaborate on the East-West question. I think because I didn't really elaborate on the historical background of Singapore in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Especially after independence, the government of Singapore was portraying itself as anti-Western. They had this anti-yellow culture movement. The yellow basically refers to Western culture. So before 1970s, the whole Singapore society placed a lot of focus on traditional folk dances of the Chinese, Indian, and the Malay, and kind of marginalized the performance of Western ballet because they were perceived as a Western product. This is in contrast to the Singapore ruling government's position as a legitimate ruler that arises from the anti-colonial movement. It was only from 1970s on when Singapore kind of had a stable development and economically vibrant, and it began to position itself in the East, between the East and West. And it shifted a focus to by incorporating more Western ideas, and also so they began to incorporate ballet from 1970s on. Yeah, that's my answer to the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beiyu. Once again, some of the questions that were really great that were raised in the chat room will still be forwarded to our speakers, but in the interest of time, we'll conclude our session 3 for today.